When I was in college, I watched a documentary about the LA riots in 1992, in which LA's Koreatown burned to the ground. There was one death, Edward Song Lee. He was murdered at the age of 18. There are a few scenes from the documentary that haunt me. I remember an interview with the mother of Edward Song Lee. As she was talking, you could tell that she held on to this grief and agony that could not go away. She talked about how she would not cry, and in fact, she could not cry. She said her tears would not roll down the front of her face, but her tears would roll back behind her eyes, as if she internalized and swallowed all her pain and grief and shoved it deep inside of her soul and held it there and never let it out. And as I was watching, I was wondering if there was something typically Korean about that. It's just a gut instinct I had at the time. A few years ago, I was talking with a colleague of mine. He's a political science professor from Georgia, and he's white, by the way. And I've been telling about my research projects, and a lot of my research and writing is rather pessimistic and tragic. I know that. I've always been that way. I'm not really sure why. It just is, or I just thought it was. One day he came up to me and rather enthusiastically and excitedly explained to me that he finally understood me. "Han!" he shouted. "You're full of Han! That explains you!" he shouted. I looked at him and said, "What?" He said that he had some old friends from out of town come over. Some were Korean Americans, and over dinner they're talking, and one of the Koreans brought up this concept of Han. And he thought, that's who you are. That's what you're full of. So what is Han? Well, in theory, it's supposed to be this distinctive and unique feeling, this essence or quality that exists in every Korean heart. It's a feeling of unresolved resentment against injustice, a sense of helplessness because this world is out to get you. The odds will never be in your favor. The world is crushing down on you all the time. That's just the nature of reality, and there's grief and pain in your soul as a result. And so you fight with all your being to survive, and you will probably fail because that's just the way the world is. It's not just. But what do? You just fight anyway. And even as you keep failing and stumbling and falling, and the world keeps beating you down, you bear and endure the suffering. You keep it deep inside you, maybe like Edward Song Lee's mother. You bear and endure the suffering. And that's just what you do. You absorb the pounding. You absorb the kicks and the punches. You take on the pain. And that feeling in the gut, that misery, that is Han. That is the essence of being Korean, so some would say. I should add that I disagree that Han is a defining feature or the essential nature of being Korean. I don't think that Koreans are predestined to be this way. There are reasons why many Koreans feel this way when they resonate with the idea of Han, or they hear about it and they think to themselves, yeah, I'm not alone. It's true. That is who I am. I mean, I think the reason why Koreans resonate with the idea of Han is in its recent history. Korean history in the last 100 years or so was really tragic. From 1910 to 1945, Korea was ruled and occupied by Japan. Long story short, it was really, really awful. Horrible injustice and oppression. The Japanese occupation of Korea ended with the end of World War II, but as soon as the war ended, Korea was split in two, separating the nation as well as families, a scar that still has not healed to this day. From 1950 to 53, Korea was devastated by the Korean War. Again, more awfulness. And after the war, Korea was economically devastated. Korea's had roughly a century of continual horror and suffering. And so I think for the last 100 years or so, Koreans have internalized this idea that their essence and their identity is pain, injustice, suffering, endurance, cruelty, and survival. That is a strength of being Korean, to bear the pain of the universe and keep moving forward step by step, not knowing if it'll ever yield to anything. I think this idea of Han in the Korean American context and finding its expression in that first generation of Koreans who work long, hard hours in small businesses in difficult parts of all these cities across America. And for their children, their Han was they just study and study and study and study. And no one complains. What good would it do? Because you can't change anything. They just endure and try to survive. I think of Han as a form of coping. And everyone needs to find a way to cope with their pain. And Koreans have had a lot of pain. If you don't find a way of coping, you just give up and die. And if you look at South Korea in terms of economics and quality of life and technology, or if you look at the Koreans in the US, it's not the worst form of coping. It's yielded some positive results. So this is a question I like to think about. Let's just say Korean culture is characterized by this thing called Han, or what we think is Han. If that's the case, when Koreans practice Christianity, does Han affect, shape, or color, inflect the way we understand our faith, the way we understand who God is, what is our salvation? I think clearly it does. So I'd like to think about that in the next few sessions of this.